They marched 100 people across my front yard every Sunday morning like it was a public park, and for a long time I kept telling myself it was just a misunderstanding, until the day I stood at my kitchen window and watched a woman in a pastel cardigan toss her empty coffee cup into my wife's flower bed, without even looking down. That was the moment something in me shifted. Not snapped, not exploded, just shifted, slow and heavy, like a door closing. My name's Daniel Harper. My wife, Elise, and I left Chicago back in 2009. We were both pushing 40, burned out from city noise, sirens at 2 a.m., neighbors you never learn the names of. We found this little town in western Pennsylvania called Maple Hollow. 2 stoplights, 1 hardware store, a diner that still served meatloaf on Wednesdays, and a white-steepled church that rang its bell every Sunday at 9 sharp. It felt like something out of a postcard. The house was what sold us. A Victorian built in 1889, tall narrow windows, wraparound porch, gingerbread trim that needed love but had good bones. It sat on just over 2 acres, which for us felt like owning a national park. I remember Elise standing in the yard during the showing, arms out, laughing like a kid. "We can plant peonies here," she said, pointing to the eastern edge, "and hydrangeas along the fence, and maybe a little orchard." We bought it within a month. For the first 6 years, it was everything we hoped for. The church next door, First Covenant Chapel, was small and quiet. 50, maybe 60 parishioners on a busy Sunday. We'd wave to them from the porch as they walked by on the sidewalk. Sometimes they'd wave back. Sometimes they'd stop and chat. We donated to their Christmas toy drive once. Elise baked pies for their summer fundraiser. It felt neighborly, uncomplicated. Then in 2016, they hired a new pastor. His name was Pastor Nolan Briggs. Early 40s, sharp jawline, always perfectly pressed shirts. He came from a megachurch outside Columbus, and from the first Sunday he stepped into that pulpit, you could feel the energy change. People said he was dynamic, visionary, a community builder. What that meant in practice was this: more services, more events, more people. Within a year, attendance doubled, then tripled. Sunday mornings turned into a steady stream of SUVs and minivans circling the block looking for parking. The church lot held maybe 40 cars, and once that filled up, folks started parking along Maple Street, then Oak, then eventually, along the narrow gravel shoulder that bordered our property. At first it was just a couple people cutting across our lawn to save a few steps. I noticed it one Sunday while trimming the hedges. A man in loafers stepped off the gravel, gave me a little nod, and walked diagonally through our grass toward the church's side entrance. I remember thinking, that's new. The next week it was 3 people. The week after that, maybe 10. By late spring, there was a visible path worn into our yard. A faint brown line where grass used to be. Elise tried to laugh it off. "Maybe we should charge admission," she joked one morning, but I could see the tightness around her eyes. She had spent years building that garden. She knew every bulb, every root system like they were pets. Things escalated fast after that. People didn't just walk across anymore. They hurried. They dragged strollers. Kids ran. Someone dropped a powdered donut and ground it into the soil with their heel. One afternoon, I found a plastic communion cup wedged between my hostas. I decided to talk to Pastor Briggs. It was after the second service, and he was standing by the church doors shaking hands like a politician. I waited until the crowd thinned. "Pastor," I said, extending my hand. "I'm Daniel Harper, your neighbor." He smiled wide, firm handshake. "Daniel, yes, beautiful property you've got there." "Thank you. That's actually what I wanted to mention. Your congregation's been cutting across our lawn. It's starting to cause damage. I was hoping you could ask folks to stick to the sidewalk." He nodded immediately, sympathetic expression locked in. "Oh my goodness, I'm so sorry about that." "Absolutely. I'll make an announcement next Sunday. We want to be good neighbors." I walked home feeling relieved. Problem solved. Except the following Sunday was worse. More people than ever. It was like my request had somehow advertised the shortcut. I stood at the window watching waves of them cross. A woman in heels stumbled on one of Elise's stepping stones and knocked it sideways. 2 teenage boys cut straight through the flower bed instead of around it. That's when the coffee cup happened. I called Pastor Briggs that afternoon. "Hey, Nolan," I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's actually gotten worse." There was a pause on the line, just long enough to feel intentional. "Well, Daniel," he replied, tone shifting slightly, "I did mention it. But you know how it is. When people see others walking a certain way, they follow. It's about convenience. It's private property, I said. I understand, he replied, softer now, almost pastoral, but we're trying to grow something meaningful here. Community sometimes requires flexibility. Flexibility. That word sat in my chest like a stone. Over the next few weeks, the damage multiplied. Elise replanted tulips 3 times. We installed small decorative signs that said private property, please use sidewalk. They were ignored. A couple were knocked over. One disappeared entirely. What bothered me most wasn't the grass. Grass grows back. It was the assumption, the quiet entitlement. Like our yard had become an extension of their parking lot. One evening, sitting at the kitchen table, Elise looked at me and said, "If we don't draw a line now, there won't be a line left to draw." That's when I called a lawyer. Her name was Margaret Ellis, local, mid-60s, silver hair cut sharp at the jaw, the kind of woman who didn't waste syllables. She listened carefully as I explained everything. "Daniel," she said finally, folding her hands, "that's trespass. Plain and simple. Church or not. Can they claim some kind of public access?" I asked. She shook her head. "Not without a recorded easement." And I'd know. She sent a formal letter to First Covenant Chapel demanding they stop immediately. Their response came 2 weeks later. They claimed the path across our property was a historic pedestrian route that predated both our home and the current church building. I actually laughed when I read it. There had never been a path there before 2016. For 6 quiet years, not a single footprint cut that way. Margaret didn't laugh. "They're testing you," she said, "seeing if you'll back down." I looked out the window at the worn dirt line slicing through Elise's garden. "I won't." And that was the moment the neighborly misunderstanding turned into a fight. I wish I could tell you that once lawyers got involved, people suddenly remembered their manners, but that's not how it went. If anything, things hardened. Margaret filed the complaint in county court by early fall. Nothing dramatic, no television courtroom theatrics, just paperwork, property maps, photographs of trampled beds, and that ugly dirt scar cutting across our lawn like a wound that wouldn't close. I thought once it became official, once the church realized we were serious, they'd rein it in. Instead, the following Sunday, attendance hit a record. I stood on the porch with my coffee and watched the parade. That's what it felt like, a parade without music, people streaming diagonally across our yard in clusters. Some avoided eye contact. Some looked almost defiant. One older man slowed down near the porch and gave me this tight smile, the kind you give someone you've already decided is wrong. Inside, Elise pretended not to watch, but I could see her shoulders tense every time footsteps crunched across gravel. A week later, something new happened. Pastor Briggs addressed us from the pulpit. Now, I wasn't inside the church, but word travels fast in a town like Maple Hollow. By Tuesday afternoon, 3 different people had mentioned it. Mrs. Calloway from the diner told me first, lowering her voice as she refilled my coffee. "He didn't say your names," she said. "But he talked about obstacles to growth, about being unwelcome." Unwelcome. That word stung more than flexibility. Apparently, he'd said something along the lines of, sometimes when a community is expanding its reach, resistance can come from unexpected places, but we respond with grace. Grace. I started noticing the looks more after that. At the hardware store. At the grocery checkout. Not hostility exactly, but a quiet judgment, like we were the couple who hated church. We didn't hate church. We hated strangers treating our yard like a public walkway. Margaret warned me this might happen. "They'll frame it as persecution," she said one afternoon in her office. "It's an effective narrative. Big church, small-minded neighbor." So what do? We stick to facts. Facts, unfortunately, don't always win popularity contests. By late October, Elise's garden looked exhausted. Not destroyed, but tired. You could see the hesitation in her when she planted anything new near the worn path. Why invest love in something that'll get crushed by Sunday? One afternoon, I found her standing out there alone, holding a broken peony stem like it was something fragile and living. "I used to love Sundays," she said quietly. "Now I dread them." That's when I realized this wasn't just about grass anymore. It was about our sense of safety, our sense of home. The place we'd poured our savings and our middle-aged hope into was starting to feel invaded. The church's legal response arrived in November. They doubled down on the so-called historic pedestrian access claim. Their attorney, A polished firm from Pittsburgh attached affidavits from two longtime congregants who swore they remembered people walking that route decades ago. Margaret raised an eyebrow when she read that. Memory is flexible, she muttered. She pulled property records going back 100 years. Old plats, surveyor notes, zoning maps. Nothing. Not a single recorded easement. Not one mention of public access across our parcel. They don't have it, she said firmly. Which means this comes down to whether a judge believes your evidence over their sentiment. Court was set for early February. Winter came, and with it, a brief reprieve. Fewer services, icy ground discouraging the shortcut. For a couple months, our yard rested. Snow covered the path, smoothing it into anonymity. I remember standing there one morning thinking maybe this whole thing would fade with the season. Then spring crept back in. The thaw revealed the dirt line again, darker and deeper than before. And the crowds returned. One Sunday, I stepped outside as a group approached. "Folks," I said calmly, hands in my jacket pockets, "please use the sidewalk." A woman in a bright scarf stopped mid-stride. "Oh, are you the one suing the church?" she asked, not unkindly but loud enough for others to hear. "I'm asking you not to trespass," I replied. She pursed her lips. "We're just trying to get to service. There's a sidewalk. It adds 5 minutes." I almost laughed. 5 minutes. Behind her, a teenage boy rolled his eyes dramatically and kept walking, stepping right past me onto our grass. That moment, standing there as they brushed by like I was an inconvenience, something inside me stopped hoping they'd choose decency on their own. February arrived cold and gray. The courtroom was smaller than I'd imagined. Fluorescent lights, wooden benches, the faint smell of old paper. Pastor Briggs sat across the aisle in a navy suit, looking composed, almost serene. He nodded at me once, polite but distant. Judge Harold Whitaker presided. Mid-50s, wire-rimmed glasses, patient expression that suggested he'd seen every flavor of neighbor dispute imaginable. Margaret presented our case cleanly. Photos, survey maps, testimony about the damage. Elise spoke briefly, voice steady but soft, explaining how she'd cultivated the garden for years. The church's attorney argued community benefit, tradition, shared space. He used phrases like implied access and long-standing practice. At one point, he gestured toward us and said, "My clients simply seek to continue a harmless pattern of neighborly accommodation." Accommodation. I leaned forward, unable to stop myself. "Your Honor," I said when allowed to speak, "we accommodated it for months. We asked politely. We put up signs. We called. We're not trying to stop worship. We're trying to protect our home." Judge Whitaker listened quietly, flipping through the deed copies. Finally, he removed his glasses and looked directly at the church's attorney. "Show me the easement," he said. There was a pause. "There is no recorded easement, Your Honor," the attorney admitted, "but—" "That's sufficient," the judge interrupted gently. He ruled from the bench. "No recorded right-of-way. No legal basis for pedestrian access across our property." The church was ordered to cease and desist immediately and to post clear signage directing congregants to use the public sidewalk within 14 days. 14 days. I exhaled for what felt like the first time in months. Outside the courthouse, Pastor Briggs approached us. "Daniel," he said quietly, "I hope you understand this was never personal." "It felt personal," I replied. "We're just trying to serve people. And I'm just trying to protect my yard." For a second, something flickered in his expression, frustration maybe, or disbelief that we hadn't folded. "We'll review the ruling," he said finally. 14 days passed. No signs appeared. The following Sunday, the first wave of parishioners crossed our lawn like nothing had happened. I stood at the window, court order in my hand. Elise didn't say anything this time. She just looked at me, and I knew the polite phase was over. By day 15, I stopped waiting for someone else to fix it. I had given them time. I had given them courtesy. I had given them the benefit of the doubt more times than I care to admit. And standing there in the kitchen, watching another line of strangers cut across our yard like the judge's order was nothing more than a polite suggestion, something inside me settled. Not anger exactly, more like clarity. I folded the court order, set it on the counter, and said, "Okay." Elise looked up from the table. "Okay, what?" "Okay, we build the line." The next morning, I called a landscaping company out of Greensburg. Family-owned. The owner, a guy named Rick, came out that afternoon in a mud-splattered pickup and walked the length of the property with me. You want privacy, Hedge? He asked, kicking at the worn path with the toe of his boot. 6 feet minimum. Dense. Something that says not today. He grinned. Got just the thing. We chose a row of emerald green arborvitae, thick and fast-growing. Rick explained spacing, root depth, irrigation. I nodded through most of it, my eyes drifting toward the church lot where a couple volunteers were setting up folding tables for some midweek event. I wasn't building a fortress. I was reclaiming a boundary. We scheduled installation for Saturday. Word travels fast in a small town, especially when a truckload of trees shows up next door to the church. By noon, half the block knew what was happening. Rick's crew worked methodically, digging a trench along the entire edge that faced Church Street. The line followed exactly where the shortcut had been carved, like we were stitching up a scar. Elise stood on the porch for most of it, arms crossed, watching roots drop into earth. There was something almost ceremonial about it. Each tree lowered into place felt like a quiet statement. This is ours. We didn't stop there. At both corners where our driveway met the street, I had decorative wrought iron gates installed. Not aggressive, not barbed wire. Just elegant black iron with a simple latch and lock. By dusk, the hedge stood in a neat, unbroken row. 6 feet tall, thick enough that you couldn't see through to the other side. It looked peaceful. Sunday morning came cool and bright. I woke up earlier than usual and poured coffee before the bells rang. Elise joined me at the window without a word. We didn't have to say it. We were both waiting. The first wave arrived around 8:40. A silver SUV parked along the gravel shoulder. A family of 4 stepped out. The father adjusted his tie, glanced at the church, then started toward the familiar diagonal line. And stopped. He blinked. The hedge stood there like it had always belonged. He looked left, looked right, took a step closer as if maybe there was an opening he hadn't noticed before. There wasn't. Behind him, another couple approached, slowing as confusion rippled through the small crowd. A teenage girl actually said, out loud, "Wait, what?" From our window, Elise let out the smallest breath of laughter. Not cruel, just relieved. Within minutes, a cluster of parishioners had formed along the hedge, murmuring. A few walked the length of it, searching for a gap. One man tugged lightly at the iron gate and found it locked. Eventually, like water redirected by a dam, they turned and walked toward the sidewalk. 5 extra minutes. That's all it ever was. By the time the second service began, the pattern had shifted. People parked, paused at the hedge, and then made their way around the proper route. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt settled. That afternoon, there was a knock at our door. I already knew who it was. Pastor Nolan Briggs stood on the porch, hands clasped in front of him. No tie this time. His expression was tight. "Daniel," he began, "we need to talk." I stepped outside, closing the door behind me. "You put up a barrier," he said, gesturing toward the hedge as if it were something offensive. "It's landscaping. You know what I mean." I followed the court order. I replied evenly. 14 days came and went. Nothing changed. He exhaled sharply. "You've effectively cut off access the community has used for years." The court disagreed. "This makes us look hostile," he pressed. "Like we're at war with our neighbors." I couldn't help it. I laughed, short and tired. "Nolan, a war implies 2 sides attacking. We asked you to stop. You didn't." His jaw tightened. "There are such things as spite fences, Daniel. Then I suggest you talk to your attorney." For a long second, we just stood there. The hedge rustled lightly in the breeze between us. "This isn't over," he said finally. I didn't want it to start. He walked away without another word. 2 weeks later, the church filed a motion claiming the hedge was malicious, built solely to obstruct their congregation. They asked the court to compel its removal. Margaret called me as soon as she received notice. "They're reaching," she said, almost amused. "A spite fence requires proof of intent to harm without legitimate purpose. You have legitimate purpose." Still, I felt that old knot in my stomach as we returned to court. Judge Whitaker looked almost bored this time. He reviewed photos of the hedge, the permits, the installation invoice. He listened to the church's attorney argue that the barrier disrupted the spirit of community. Then he leaned back and folded his hands. "Property owners have the right to landscape and fence their property within code," he said calmly. "The previous order was clear. This motion is denied." He didn't stop there. Given the church's failure to comply within the 14-day window, He ordered them to reimburse our legal fees and pay for documented landscaping damage. The total came to just over $4,500. It wasn't about the money, but I won't pretend the acknowledgement didn't feel good. After that, something shifted in town. Some people avoided us. A few still do. I've overheard whispers at the diner, little comments about being unneighborly. Once, a man in the hardware store muttered, "Hope the hedge keeps you warm at night." But others surprised us. Mrs. Calloway dropped off a pie one evening. "Boundaries are healthy," she said simply. A retired couple down the street admitted they'd been frustrated by overflow parking for years, but didn't want to say anything. "You just happened to be the ones in the path," the husband told me. 3 years have passed now. The arborvitae have grown taller than 6 feet, thick and lush, a solid green wall in summer and a quiet snow-dusted line in winter. Birds nest in them. In the fall, they catch golden light in a way that makes the whole yard glow. On Sundays, I still hear the church bells. I still see families walking along the sidewalk, the way they always could have. Sometimes I wonder if it had to go that far. If I could have handled it differently. Maybe built the hedge sooner. Maybe been firmer from the start. Maybe less patient. What I know is this. Community doesn't mean surrendering your boundaries. Grace doesn't require you to be a doormat. And growth, real growth, respects the space it expands into. I don't hate Pastor Briggs. I don't even think he's a villain. I think he believed so strongly in his vision that he stopped seeing the cost to the people next door. And maybe we were the inconvenient reminder that not everything in a small town is communal. So here's what I'm curious about. Were we wrong? Was the hedge too much? Should we have let it go for the sake of harmony? Or is protecting your home, your land, your peace exactly what you're supposed to do? I'd genuinely like to know where you land on this. Drop your thoughts in the comments. Tell me what you would have done if 100 strangers treated your yard like a shortcut. Share this with someone who believes boundaries matter, or someone who thinks we should have just shown more grace. Because in the end, this wasn't just about a path through grass. It was about where you draw the line and what you're willing to do when someone keeps stepping over it.